Why is Bitcoin going up long term? There are two reasons. The first reason is over here. It's the monetary expansion. What we see here at the vertical line is when Bitcoin has launched. Since Bitcoin's launch, the monetary supply increased by more than 140%. So that's the first of the reasons. It's the reason also why Bitcoin got created. It's the ever increasing money supply or devaluation of the US dollar. Now, Bitcoin didn't just go up by 142% since its launch. It went up way more, and that's because of the second reason. The main driver for Bitcoin's long-term price appreciation is its adoption, not as a payment vehicle, not as a means of payment, but rather as a vehicle for saving. It's a savings vehicle. Now in this video, we are going to quantify Bitcoin's adoption as a savings vehicle. And there's two ways to look at this. We can simply look at the number of Bitcoin somebody holds, but we can also look at the US dollar amount that is held in Bitcoin. And the results that we get from those two different perspectives are very, very different. Let's start off with the number of wallets that have 0.01 BTC, or roughly $600 worth of Bitcoin. We see how this tends to grow quite consistently over time. Not so much recently, because the price was pretty high and people aren't that enthusiastic about buying high, but long term, right? We are talking about long-term trends. This looks like very solid adoption. Now let's go one order of magnitude up. Let's look at the number of wallets with $6,000. Also a pretty constant growth. Let's have a look at the full coiners, the people with at least one Bitcoin. Also constant growth, but it seems to be slowing down somewhat recently, right? When we look at this point here, the peak of the bull market in 2017 to our current prices, the number of those wallets with one Bitcoin, it went up by maybe 50%, a bit less than 50%, while the price 3x'd roughly. Let's go another order of magnitude up. This is now a minimum holding of 10 BTC. This is going sideways for quite a while. Pretty much zero growth in the number of wallets with 10 Bitcoin since the end of 2017, where Bitcoin was at 20K. Let's look at the mega whales, so 100 Bitcoin. That's now 6 million worth of BTC. And we've seen an interesting reflection point here in March of 2017. But again, if you just look at the current level, pretty much zero growth since 2015. Now, what's interesting here, when we just look at the number of Bitcoin per wallet, it almost looks like the mega whales had dumped on retail, right? The number of those mega whales went down while the number of retail investors continued to climb. And the wallets with currently worth $600,000 worth of Bitcoin, they tend to sell when we are high and they tend to buy when we are low. In other words, they're also milking the system. Now, this perspective is actually flawed. The number of wallets with 10 Bitcoin or with 100 Bitcoin did not necessarily increase in the last years. But the value that's in those wallets definitely did. And this now becomes a bit philosophical, right? But most people measure their wealth not just in Bitcoin, but they measure it in US dollars, because in the end we spend US dollars or some other fiat currency that's highly linked to the US dollar in order to consume. And so especially once you have some wealth accumulated, when you're at $500,000, at $1 million, maybe at $10 million, when you've got that much money, you are to a degree diversified. You don't have all your money just in one basket. Thus, I think the way more important measure is how many wallets are there with X amount of US dollars? As in, how many wallets are there that have $1,000 worth of Bitcoin? How many wallets are there that have $1 million worth of Bitcoin? And how is that developing over time? And this tells a very, very different story. Let's first look at the number of wallets with play money in the system, so $100 or more. Let's again compare those two data points, today versus the end of 2017. I like to look at those two data points because the price 3x'd. It's also a somewhat representative time frame where Bitcoin is not just in the few cents, but where it has already matured a bit. And so those kinds of wallets increased in number from 9 million to roughly 21 million. So maybe a 2.2x, 2.3x, something like this. The number of such wallets grew by a bit more than 100%. Let's go again, one order of magnitude up. At least $1,000 worth of Bitcoin. That went from 3 million to currently more than 10 million. The number of wallets that have $1,000 saved in Bitcoin 3x'd, more than 3x'd. So it appears as if the people that have more money tend to accumulate even more over time. And so that's interesting, right? Bitcoin's price 3x and the number of wallets with $1,000 worth of Bitcoin more than 3x. Let's go another order of magnitude up. $10,000. This went from 1 million addresses, again at the peak in 2017, to currently 3.4 million. So a very similar growth. Next order of magnitude, 100K. Now 100K I believe is pretty serious money because that now includes the millionaires that use Bitcoin as a true diversifier in the portfolio, that have at least 10% of their portfolio in Bitcoin. And people that buy into the Bitcoin story are very likely holding at least those 10%. So that moved from 213,000 to currently 360,000. So again, very similar growth, a 3x. What about those mega whales? So the Bitcoin millionaires, the people that have at least $1 million in Bitcoin, there's not so many such people, 28,000 in 2017 versus 112,000 today. Now that's a clean 4x. That's even more growth. This is the complete opposite result compared to looking at this chart, right? The number of wallets that have 10 BTC. The number of wallets that have 10 BTC did not grow, but the number of wallets that have at least $1 million worth of Bitcoin more than 4x'd since the peak in 2017. So why does Bitcoin grow over the long term? It's because the people with money are now really allocating to Bitcoin. They're really holding Bitcoin and they're not selling their Bitcoin. Bitcoin is becoming a true portfolio diversifier. Bitcoin is held besides property and besides stocks and besides precious metals in a large portfolio. The small portfolios might not adopt Bitcoin as quickly, but the hedge funds and the family offices, etc., they do adopt Bitcoin. Since December 2017, that data point, the money supply grew by roughly 53%. Bitcoin's price though 3x. And that's because the millionaires and the multimillionaires, they are buying into Bitcoin and they are not selling. They're simply just allocating towards their broadly diversified portfolio. It's not necessarily only the retail people that are getting in, it's really the heavyweights. The millionaires and multimillionaires keep on holding and they're not selling despite the Bitcoin price rising over time. So maybe it's a bit more accurate to say that Bitcoin isn't necessarily a savings vehicle for the masses, it's rather adopted as a portfolio diversifier, as another asset in those very wealthy hands. If you're smart, you continue to dollar cost average into Bitcoin, you actually use it for saving. Most retail investors don't do this. If you're rich and you still don't have at least a very small allocation to Bitcoin, then I believe the risk of missing out is probably larger than the risk of potential drops. Because again, Bitcoin is pretty much time tested, right? It can drop by 60, 70, 80% and still survive. People continue to buy the bottoms. And that's because of the ever expanding number of dollars that are floating around. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give this a like and feel free to share this with your friends. If it's your first time here, feel free to also subscribe. I publish videos regularly on this channel. In case you've got Telegram, then you're more than welcome to join us. The link is down below. If you want to know how I try to get even more return on top of Bitcoin, for example, by shorting some very weak altcoins, by betting on falling prices of bad altcoins, or even by timing Bitcoin a little bit. So I've got some back tests where I try to pick bottoms and find tops, and historically they work pretty well. If you want to find out about that, there's also a premium membership. That's down below. It's thebitcoinstrategy.com.